Oh, hello. Welcome to the Mermaid Tavern. Cheers. Slàinte mhath. Skål. Bottoms up. Um, yeah, probably the Pete Best tribute for his birthday this year. Yeah, Pete Best is going to be 83 on Sunday. Do you remember? It's not a pint of, you know what, probably the best lager in the world. Probably. Oh, come on, Carlsberg. Be nice if I could get some free samples. I must have a drink now, mustn't I? Now, yeah, when the anthology was on, the Beatles anthology, when it was first shown in the 90s, yeah, in this country during the ad breaks, they had himself Pete Best. Pete Best was in the anthology. Yeah, they had him with his drumsticks, and he just threw them away. And you remember, it's on. You can check it out. It's on YouTube. That advert, but it looked like it was filmed at the Cavern, but it wasn't. I don't think. There's the voiceover on it. Probably the Pete Best lager in the world. Yeah. Oh, he should have been asked to take part in that, don't you think? The anthology. It was great, the anthology, when it came out, but I really think they missed an opportunity there with Pete for him to be on the anthology. It would have been so nice. It wasn't going to happen, was it? For all the reasons we know about. Yeah, it wasn't going to happen. But yeah, he should have been asked. I heard it said, you've probably heard this as well, that about that time, of course, he was paid royalties, wasn't he, for the songs that he recorded on, like the Decca tapes, other ones as well that Pete was on the drums for. So he got royalties for it. Got quite a good payout, I think, for the time anyway. I think it was a good payout. Um, but yeah, it was said that Paul has actually phoned him and said, some wrongs need to be righted. Now, Pete, I read Pete denies this. He said it was Neil Aspinall that actually rang him, which kind of makes sense because if you don't know, Neil fell in love with with Pete's mum, Mona, and Mona, of course, had a child, Rogue. Yeah, so Pete's half brother. So it kind of makes sense, and of course, he was running Apple, wasn't he, Neil? So it kind of makes sense it was him rather than Paul. Would have been so nice, though, wouldn't it, if Paul had kind of reached out. I wondered, do you know this, if there's been any contact, as in they've met or talked on the phone since 1962, since, when was it? July? Should know this, shouldn't I? You can tell I'm not a Beatle brain. Well, I have read a few books, but I'm more like a sort of bird brain for remembering some facts like that. Alan, you'd know. Alan, my friend Alan. Yeah, I wonder if there's been any contact between them at all over the years. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure there hasn't been any contact in all this time. You know, might be wrong about it, but I looked on Reddit, and someone had actually posed that very question. And you know what someone had put? Well, Ringo used to call him at midnight, laughing and singing "My Bonnie" out of tune down the phone. The sort of thing you could see Ringo doing, actually, couldn't you? I'm sure he didn't. Mm. And someone else was speculating on that site how cold they can appear. You know, like once you've kind of dropped out of their orbit, the Beatles, that is, they're going to drop you cold. As if you're dead. Does seem funny, doesn't it? Particularly with Neil being effectively family, and he was still running Apple, wasn't he? Till what, about 2005? I'd be wrong, maybe a few years out on that one. I wonder. Yeah, it just seemed funny. There was not even any formal contact. Anyway, I wonder if John would have reached out if Oh, you can mess your head up with all these what ifs about John, can't you? You really can. It's not good to go down that territory. Do you know, I'd love to see Paul, and many people would put Ringo on Paul, but particularly Paul, invite him up on stage for a gig. Well, just be on stage. You didn't even drum, just on stage. Pete Best, the original drummer of the Beatles. Well, one of the original drummers. You know, the most well established before Ringo, as in experienced. Um, how many Beatle drummers were there? Do you know what? I should do the old. I should definitely revive the old Beatle Brain of Britain, which used to be on. I was talking about that recently, wasn't I? They used to have it at the Beatles convention, Liverpool, Beatles Brain. My friend Alan was always kind of, if not the top, but near the top. I should revive that on here. I think I'll need a few more subscribers before I do that. Hint, hint. Yeah, if he had him on stage. Yeah, Paul invites Pete Best up on stage Sunday the 15th of December in Manchester. Why that date? Because that's when I'm seeing him. Are you seeing Paul? Yeah. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Yeah. We're only dreamers, aren't we? We're only dreamers. We're only dreamers. I know I'm not the only one, but yeah, we're only dreamers. Funny, again, talking about the anthology album. I got one of Pete's CDs. It was called Hayman's Green. Now that is the name of the area or the street where the Casbah Coffee Club is in West Derby in Liverpool, Hayman's Green. And Pete had like a CD of his band some years back, and on the front there was a fragment of the pitch. You know, and it was the fragment. I hadn't realised this at the time. You probably did. On the front of the Anthology One album, which Klaus Vormann had designed, hadn't he? They'd actually torn a bit of that famous picture of the Beatles, the the Mersey Beat poll winners picture, them together with Pete as the drummer, of course, and his face had been torn off, and you can see Ringo beneath it on the Please Please Me album. Clever, can't remember. But yeah, I hadn't realised that, and then they put that fragment back on the front of the missing fragment, so to speak, back on Hayman's Green, which I thought that was quite a nice touch to do that. Yeah. So yeah, this last summer I went down to the Casbah coffee club in West Derby for the first time ever. I can't believe it's the first time I'd ever been down there. I'd always wanted to go down there, but I just never had. And wow, have you been? It's kind of magical, isn't it? It's just the most magical place connected with the Beatles I could imagine. I mean, that's not taking anything away from the Cavern, which, as we know, isn't the real Cavern, but it's still a wonderful space to imagine in, isn't it? And I've heard people having a go at the Cavern, say it's not the real Cavern. I did a show at the Cavern once, and I was quite proud of it because I did a theatre show there, and I was the first person to do a theatre show at the Cavern. I was bigging that up, and then somebody said, it wasn't the Cavern. And I said, yeah, I know it's not the Cavern, but it's still quite nice, isn't it? But yeah, the Casbah is magical. It's like a sort of wonderful time capsule. You've been down there. It's the old coal cellar, this massive old house in West Derby that Mo Best had bought. You know the story about that. Never Say Die, the racehorse that she got the winnings from and bought that big old place. Of course, it's been in the news recently, hasn't it? Because they're opening it up as an Airbnb, or they have opened it up as an Airbnb. You can stay there in like the John Lennon suite and the everybody's suite apart from Ringo's, because rightly so, he never played there, But of course, I think it opened in. I remember my friend Alan was telling me it opened in like 1999, and then after that, sometime in the early 2000s, it became a place where they started using it for gigs again, and of course Pete himself playing there. But it's just, yeah, I can't big up the Casbah enough, and I want to go back there again. It's, as I say, it's just brilliant. not taking anything away from the cavern. That doesn't need me to big it up anyway, does it? Enough tourists flock there, but no, neither does the Casbah. It can be a bit difficult to find because it's a bit further out, but even when you get there, it can be a bit difficult to find it. But I tell you what is most apparent there when you wander around. I had the best ever tour guide I have ever had in Rogue Best Jr. He's the son of Rogue Best, who was the son of Neil Aspinall. So yeah, Neil Aspinall is his granddad. I'm terrible at that. But he was so great, and I know anybody who knows me knows I know about tour guides, and I've done a bit myself in my time, and I know a good tour guide. And Rogue Best Junior, brilliant, mate. I don't imagine in my wildest dreams you're watching this, but the best. I said to him at the time, I was like gushing at him. This is so magical. And what is really apparent there is Mona Best. Mo Best. She's like the matriarch of the family, of the Best clan. And it's a family affair. They run it all. The mother of Mersey Beat, as she was known. Mo. What a formidable, wonderful woman. Very beautiful too. You see the pictures of her. She was younger. And her presence there, benign presence, is really quite magical. Yeah. Amazing. Honestly, please, if you haven't been there, go. I went with my friend Julie, my dear friend Julie, and she met Rogue Best, and Julie she won't me saying this, is the daughter of Mal Evans, Beatles roadie, of course, legendary figure, and she met at a warm embrace with Rogue Best Junior, and later on in the day or the night before, she met. I think she'd already met him, Rogue Best. So, of course, it was the daughter and the son of the respective roadies coming together. That was nice, and I felt privileged. To be part of that. I really did. It was a lovely moment. There's a picture I'm going to put on the screen here. You can see that. I have always loved that era, the pre-Fab Four. The pre-Fab Four era. No play on the Ruttles, of course, if you know your Ruttles. But I've always loved that era the most. I mean, there's so many great eras of the Beatles, isn't it? What's the best era? But that era has always been my favourite. Ever since I read Hunter Davis's book, which I read, I remember getting out of the library. It was like 1978 or 79, and reading it, and I'd already fallen in love with the music by then, but I didn't realise the whole story. All the Hamburg Day, they'd had Stu Sutcliffe, the story of him at art school. I love the stories of John and Stu at art school, all the stuff, and another drum, and Pete Best. I just loved all that, and it's always still, even though I love all the other eras as well. It's always been my favourite era. Yeah. What did John say? John said something about in the 1970s. John's had a lot to say, didn't he, in the 1970s? Not all of it most of it not complimentary about various things. And he said something like Pete was a lousy drummer. I think that's kind of stuck, even though there's no real evidence for that. It's a big debate, isn't it? It's a big debate. Why was Pete kicked out the Beatles? Why was he asked to leave? Recently that movie Midas Man, it kind of just plays into the same narrative in a way, which is a bit of a lazy. There's a bit of a lazy narrative which journalists and screenwriters go into. I suppose they do because it's easier to show black and white rather than the grey areas, and it's always grey areas which make things in life, isn't it? But John Lennon also said something interesting, which I was looking at again the other day. He said, I can't remember exactly the quote. It was words to the effect that the Beatles' best work was never recorded. When they were playing the dance halls and Hamburg, the sort of excitement they generated, and Pete was there for 2 years. And Lennon said that was the best of the Beatles. So he was the best of the Beatles. I mean, I know that's not taking anything away from Ringo, who I love to bits. But when Pete was asked to leave, it was something like George Martin had said he wasn't precise enough. And then, of course, they were on the cusp of a record deal. They had a contract, but they were nervous that it could be withdrawn, and they'd gone through all the other labels. And when George put doubts, sowed the seed of doubt in them, and he said something like, not precise enough, and Pete was out. And of course, you know the story. It's dealt with in Midas Man. It's a bombshell for him. None of the others talk to him again. They just drop him like that. And Ringo's in. In fact, they said that in the Midas Man movie, didn't they? That again, that's, I think, from what I've heard, another thing that's not really true, because they had about 3 other people. Is that right? Beatle Brain of Britain. They had about 3 other people who, if you know, please do go in the comments. I'd love to read some comments on this, because everything I've done so far hasn't had any comments. Oh dear, am I inviting comments? That's not a good thing, is it? Be kind in your comments, please. I'm not a Beatle Brain. But yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, they had a few other drummers. He wasn't the first choice, is what I heard. Do you know? Well, the first choice. And even when Ringo rocks up with the band at EMI, George Martin apparently is quite surprised that Pete's gone and Ringo's in. And even then, poor old Ringo has to set out a few tunes, because they have the session drummer, don't they? Andy White. He's on, I think to this day, Andy White is on Love Me Do on the Please Please Me album. And I think P.S. I Love You is, P.S. I Love You. I think that's my favourite. I long think about this, and P.S. I Love You is probably my favourite Beatles song of all time. I love it. Just love it. It's perfect. I think is that right, Beatle Brains? Andy White is on that. And even the first early copies of the Love Me Do single, the early pressings, it wasn't Ringo. It was Andy White. But later they changed it. I think so. I think that's why Love Me Do is worth quite a lot, isn't it? If you get it, that red label one, which has Andy White on it, not Ringo. Anyway, I listened to one of those, there's videos on here where people have isolated various tracks, and there's somebody who's isolated the drum tracks from Love Me Do, and they've isolated like Pete's, Ringo's, and Andy White's, and you can hear them all. What does really stand out to me from that, being in my non-drummer kind of ear, is how militaristic Andy White sounds. Talk about precision. But the other two, pretty much. I mean, it's quite a simple bit of beat, isn't it, going on there for Love Me Do? God, I sound like I know what I'm talking about. Don't get that impression about me. Do you remember George in the anthology saying something that Ringo was always going to be a Beatle? He was just waiting in the wings. That part in the film, he comes in, which was a bit sort of, considering, he wasn't the first choice. He'd sat in before, hadn't he? With them, he knew them, and he was friendly with them. I think particularly him and George got on well. That's what I get. I think I've always got that. I think George was the most instrumental. Am I right in getting him into the Beatles? I think that was the case. But Pete, after all these years, he's still getting people questioning his ability, which would piss me off. There are people that still question Ringo's ability, aren't there? Probably the same people who think that line about John Lennon saying that Ringo wasn't even the best, but he wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. There are still people who think that. That's Jesper Carrot, of course, started that one off. There are still some people who think Lennon said that, which is brilliant. So he's funny, Ringo. He didn't endear himself to Brian Epstein initially. because I think Brian Epstein had to kind of do a dash out to his house quickly because early on, this is before Pete was replaced. They needed a drummer quickly. I don't know what had happened, but I just heard they needed a drummer quickly. He dashed out to his house, and Ringo's drinking his tea, and he says something like, "I'm not going anywhere till I've drunk my tea." Brilliant. But then Pete, after the Beatles, he's in a few bands. Lee Curtis and the All Stars. Is it? I can't remember. There's one. He goes over to America. The Pete Best combo. There's various things. I think in 1968 he gives it up. And bless him, I read his. He wrote this book, which I bought back in the 80s. I got him to sign it for me. He was a really nice guy, really sort of gentle and modest and unshowy. That's not a real word, but it does. I kind of like that word, unshowy, because I like unshowy people, really. And he was. He signed that book, and he doesn't talk about it in that book, but I read that he went to work in unloading a bakery van, and then in the 1970s, if you'd wandered into Garston Job Centre in Liverpool, you could have had Pete Best interviewing you about work. That's ironic, isn't it? Do you remember that film? It was the third and last time that Ian Hart played John Lennon, Snodgrass. What happens if John Lennon had quit the Beatles on the cusp of fame? He'd be working in a job centre now. It's ironic, isn't it? I can't imagine Lennon having quit the Beatles. By the way, that was a flawed premise, but funny though that Pete ends up working in a job centre. And then I think when Hunter Davis was writing that book, Pete didn't want to cooperate in it. I think there are some quotes in there, but I don't think Pete had anything to do with that. Did he? But Pete served the apprenticeship. He was there in Hamburg. He was there. He did it. He had 2 years with them. He can't have been that bad a drummer for being with them for 2 years. It's nonsense. But John said something else which was great in the 70s. He said something like, Pete was a great drummer, but Ringo was a great Beatle. And I think, well, I'm just going to leave that hanging there, as they say. Yeah, I think that sort of sums it up. Pete, you're a great guy. You're a great guy. You'll always be a Beatle. Nobody will ever take that away from you. You'll always be part of that great legend, that great story. Almost mythology, but no, it's real. You'll always be there. And you were there. I was there, by the way, when he performed on stage in the late 80s at in the ballroom, the main stage at the Adelphi Hotel, Liverpool, for the convention. He was there. I remember that. I think Rogue was playing as well. I think that's what started. And bless him, he's 83 on Sunday, and he's still gigging. He was still gigging this summer. I was asking Rogue Best Jr. about him, and he's bless you, Pete. Bless you. You're a legend. Happy birthday. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time, shall I? Yeah? Chin chin.